Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Narzia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. The goal behind the resurgence of terrorist attacks in Syria becomes more obvious. Some Western media outlets have admitted that the U.S. and the UAE have discussed lifting sanctions on Syria if President Bashar al-Assad distances himself from Iran and stops the flow of weapons to Hezbollah. It seems the Zionists and company can no longer tolerate the existence of the resistance front. So if the goal of the terrorists is to weaken or destroy the resistance front, then one must ask, who benefits from this action and who is paying the bill for the terrorists? So we're going to take a look at the latest out of Syria on the Spotlight. I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, Batul Sobeiti, activist and political analyst out of London, and Syed Mohsen Abbas, journalist and political analyst, also out of London. Well, thank you both for being with us. I'm going to start this off with Batul. I mean, it appears that the resistance front has inflicted heavy blows on the Zionist regime and that the entity and its supporters are willing to do whatever it can now to weaken the resistance. I mean, your thoughts on this and how the resistance front has inflicted major blows against the regime to get it to this point that it's willing to do whatever it can to stop the resistance front.
Yes, so the resistance axis has highlighted the real threat that it has posed to the imperialist project in West Asia following the events from October the 7th. This was particularly seen in the fact that we've seen materially on the ground the unity of the resistance front that has effectively weakened the Israeli occupation entities to the point of real existential crisis and disintegration that exists within. So Israel right now feels existentially threatened post October the 7th. Inside 1948, the Israeli settlers feel that they are not protected by the state, which goes against the very idea of the creation of Israel as this kind of safe haven in which these Zionist settlers from across the globe can feel a sense of security, because single-handedly Gaza was able to go into 1948 on October the 7th, and that plot wasn't hatched despite the really strong, purported intelligence of the Israeli occupation entity. So that sense of security and protection is not there, and the Israelis, alongside their masters, America, feel that the resistance axis is something serious, and that if they leave it without effectively defeating it, it will get even more and more powerful, and it will thwart their whole strategy for the region, their whole presence in the region. That's why we're seeing them use the most powerful force. And the reality is the Israeli occupation entity cannot fight face to face. That is why it has ultimately failed on the ground, no matter how many weapons America gives them. That's the thing. Netanyahu comes forward and says that one of the goals of stopping the ceasefire in Lebanon is because, they want to replenish their weapons. It's not about replenishing weapons. They've been given unconditional weapons. They're too scared to fight on the ground. They're too scared to come at zero distance, which explains why they have only used the fire about the power of destruction. But that won't enable them to achieve anything on the ground, because they don't have that ability for direct confrontation. So we're seeing Plan B come into effect, and that is the resurgence of the terrorists across Syria.
Okay, well, Syed Mohsen, what is the role that Syria is playing in the resistance front, and why is this such a threat to the Zionist regime and its supporters more now than ever?
Well, firstly, Syria acts as the ground route for the axis of resistance to really be connected. They used to be petrified of the idea of a Shia crescent. Well, it's less of a Shia crescent and more of a crescent uniting the oppressed in that region, which runs from Iran through to Iraq, through to Syria, and accesses, of course, Lebanon, and via Lebanon also the Palestinian resistance. So it's very critical that for the Israelis and for the Americans that they break this road route. So that's the first role that Syria plays in terms of the broader axis of resistance. But of course, Syria also plays a massive role in terms of holding these Takfiri terrorist forces at bay in the north. And as we've seen, they are still extraordinarily dangerous. The Syrians were doing a great job. They seem to have dropped their guard, it seems, a little, and they've allowed temporarily, I believe, Aleppo to be occupied, well, certain parts of it. And of course, there's an hour mopping up operation that will have to take place, indeed, is already beginning to take shape. But of course, this is all planned. As Batul says, it's planned in Washington. This has been probably in the gestation at least a year. I'd suspect they wanted to do it next March, but it's been accelerated because of Israel's defeat in Lebanon, because they so abjectly lost in that engagement that they had to, relieve Israel, because by the Jabhat al-Nusra Fraternity and the HTS, or whatever they want to call themselves, ISIS essentially, US-backed ISIS, they needed them, to relieve the pressure on Israel and the possibility that Hezbollah could reload and continue the long war that's been promised to bring the Israeli entity down. NATO arms both these Al-Qaeda-inspired offshoots, the Nusras and the Tahrir al-Shams, but it also backs the SDF. Let's not forget that as well. In that region, virtually every one of these forces which is lined up against Syria, which Syria has been holding off and holding at bay, is basically all linked to NATO, and it's still an American-occupied land in many ways, because all that oil that's being siphoned off by the Americans, Donald Trump said, I'm taking the oil, I'm taking the oil. That's what he repeated. And into, I was watching just earlier on. This is one of the other factors that they want to grab, as usual, all of the resources of Syria that really matter.
Right, right. Well, Batul, I mean, some Western news outlets are openly admitting that the reality of the resurgence of the terrorists in Syria is all about weakening the resistance, with them saying the U.S. and the UAE are ready now to lift sanctions off of Syria if President Assad distances himself from the resistance. First of all, you're surprised that these Western news outlets are openly admitting to this. And let's talk about exactly what this means when they're saying that the sanctions could be lifted if distancing itself from the resistance.
Yes, so targeting Syria is America's plan B for a new Middle East. I think that's the first thing I'll say. America's plan A that relied on the Israeli military action to defeat the Islamic resistance of Lebanon. The idea was that after defeating the resistance there, Israel would deploy their forces in the Golan Heights to attack Syria, whilst the Takfiri mercenaries would rise in northwestern Syria to overthrow the Syrian government. That's the goal. And then from then on, these forces would then spill into Iraq, toppling the Hashd al-Sha'bi there, and then unleashing covert networks within Iran to weaken the Iranian government and the broader resistance axis. But as we've mentioned, this strategy collapsed when the Israelis' military aggression in Lebanon was met with significant resistance, which led to Israel begging for a ceasefire. So this marked ultimately that strategic defeat, in which I would class the second most major defeat after October the 7th for Israel, in that it had to wave the white flag of surrender for the Israel 2.0 project. So in response to the failure of this plan A that's led by Israel, America turned swiftly to plan B, in which it sought to achieve through political means what Israel could not achieve militarily. So rather than now relying on Israel, America is focusing on undermining Lebanon's resistance by influencing the Lebanese political and military landscape. So, key to this strategy is we're seeing the involvement of, US special forces and officials like Amos Hochstein, who are working to disarm the Lebanese resistance and weaken its position within Lebanon. But if Israel succeeded in plan A, we would have seen a double blow in Syria, as I mentioned, with Israel getting involved. But now it's unlikely that Israel would go through the Golan, because ultimately one of their tools and strategies is to purposefully create sedition within the Muslim Ummah. So right now, America is relying on the Takfiris to play that functional role and to not make it seem like Israel is hand in glove with them. So right now, what we're seeing is Syria is like a cake in the American strategy, similar to Libya. America wants to share, Turkey wants to share. The objective is not to capture Aleppo, it is to weaken Syria and to cut the supply of the resistance, as Sayyid Mohsen Abbas has echoed. So if Bashar al-Assad is listening to them, if Bashar al-Assad listened to America and decided that he wanted to distance from the resistance axis, and he didn't allow the resistance to take advantage of Syria as this kind of supply line when it comes to weapons and intelligence and ultimately as a base, then the reality is America would have made him a prince in the region. They would have made all the Arab states come and kiss Bashar al-Assad's feet. That is the reality. So they come forward and they say, we'll get rid of your debt, But Bashar al-Assad is not a fool to go after them, because he also knows that if he was to agree to their demands, then inevitably and eventually they will also get rid of him as well. And we're seeing this dirty tactic unfold in Syria, to the extent that we're seeing that even the Kurds were asked to, so the Kurds who oppose the Turks were asked to make way for the Turkish forces to come into Syria in places like Tel Rifat, where the Kurds were. When Aleppo fell, they told them to leave, and they gave it to the Turks. And now the Kurds are stationed around the Al Bukamal area to also target the Hashd al-Shabi if they were potentially going into Syria. So we're seeing a concerted effort over here by all of the NATO supporting factions like Turkey, like the Kurds, to like Jabhat al-Nusra and all those other terrorist groups, to ultimately bring Syria down because of the crucial role that it's playing as a supporting line for the resistance axis.
Well, Said Mohsen, what many analysts and supporters, of course, of the resistance knew from the beginning of the civil strife inside of Syria in 2011 is that the upheaval inside of the country for the U.S. and its allies was never really about human rights violation, but about destroying the axis of resistance. Do you think that that has become more obvious than ever, at least for those? I mean, Batu talked about the Ummah, talking about, because we know that there was some confusion among some of the Muslims back then. Do you think that this is adding some clarity to the situation, or your assessment?
Yeah, I think definitely there's far more clarity in terms of the context of what Turkey's done here and what generally the ISIS takfirists, or these Wahhabi Salafist fraternity, are up to. The reality is that Gaza and Lebanon, now Syria, are unveiling the true nature of all of these kind of nefarious groups. First, it was much harder to prove that actually all the money trails for ISIS went back to America, and even then there were many quite foolish Muslims, especially, who just wouldn't listen to that. They were on sectarian lines, on Sunni Shia lines. They were buying into many of these things. They buy into the anti-Iran narrative. There's a whole hasbara that Israel gives to all these takfiri to say that actually this is some kind of Iranian imperialist drive into the Arab world. So they fomented a lot of that fear within Arabs that there was some kind of Persianite invasion. These were all lies. These were all absolute lies at that time, but they were pumped out on a scale where even the likes of Al Jazeera and all of these kinds of agencies, which are actually clandestine fronts for Zionism. Because the fact is, ISIS and these guys, they're funded by Qatari money. Turkey and Qatar are hand in glove. They back the Muslim Brotherhood. The Ikhwan of Syria were given financial and other training and backup 2 years prior to the war on Syria. So all of what happened then was all plotted and planned with these kinds of sellout pseudo-Muslims who basically are mercenaries and on healthy payrolls, and they're continuing to do the dirty work of their masters, as it were. So yes, I think people are much more aware now. It's obvious that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra and all of these factions, so-called Caliphate and Ummah-loving factions, they've done what for Gaza exactly? Where were they for the last year and a half? Did they send troops? Did they send any funding? Were they there ready to liberate Gaza just as they're trying to liberate Aleppo? No, they weren't, because that's not their remit, that's not their role. They have no intention of doing anything of the kind for the great Muslim Ummah that they keep talking about. Their caliphate will be an Anglo-American Zionist caliphate. That's what their purpose was, something that they would have deferred back to the Americans to help them basically control that area far better and to break the axis of resistance. This is the purpose of ISIS. It always has been. It's the purpose of Al-Qaeda. It's the purpose of Turkey. And I think the biggest traitor and the biggest hypocrite in this has turned out to obviously be Erdogan, who was running the Astana process with Russia and Iran, guaranteeing some kind of peace in Syria. That was the agreement since 2017. Well, that Astana process is now in dire jeopardy. How Erdogan's going to get out of this? Well, it'll only be if the Russians allow him, cover up and say, actually, no, this ISIS invasion wasn't their idea. Fact is that Erdogan is in this right up to his neck. And I don't see how he can get out of playing this double-faced, two-faced game. Again, he's, of course, don't forget, he's supplying oil from Azerbaijan, even now, to Israel, to arm their tanks, their aeroplanes. All of the killing of Gazans is also blood on the hands of Erdogan.
Right. Well, Batul said Mohsen talked about the ceasefire agreement. I want to look at that a little bit. Of course, that was implemented in 2020 and guaranteed by Turkey to create de-escalation zones in various areas in the northern part of Syria. Let's talk about that. Do you think from the very beginning the intention of this and creating these so-called de-escalation zones was to ultimately create the chaos that we see happening? And the other side of that, why did Syria agree to that to begin with?
Right. So there was a situation in 2020, but now things have changed quite drastically and strategically. Now there is a full-blown campaign against the resistance axis to defeat it once and for all. And we're seeing the re-emergence of, this new Middle East project plan that America put in the 21st century, so in the turn of the 21st century. We're right now at a stage where America is using the full force of aggression to target the resistance with strong hits. It's almost now or never. I mean, they've seen the Israeli occupation entity crumble right before them in this past year. But now they failed in Gaza, they failed in Lebanon. And so now the next front that they've decided to move into is Syria. So yes, the agreement that you're talking about was to decrease escalations. There was a certain political agreement that was reached, so that and that also allowed Turkey to hit the kind of anti-Turkish Kurdish groups and terrorists that were present, because remember, this is also Turkey vying for its influence and control in Syria. As I said, they regard Syria as like this piece of cake that each party from the Western supported backed fronts wants a share. But now there is a new strategy. That strategy, that ceasefire that you've just mentioned, that strategy is completely fallen until a new reality comes in and changes this. But now the situation is that Aleppo is in favor of the Turks, and it's very important that the resistance axis, wakes up to the lack of expectation that they had when Aleppo fell in the day that it did. And it cannot wake up late. They cannot reach a point where these terrorists go into Aleppo and then they wake up. So I think what's happening right now is we're seeing the restructuring and we're seeing the absorbance of those hits. And we're seeing political efforts that will walk alongside the military efforts, because just as the resistance axis prevented the spread of terrorism in the past decade and ensured Syria's survival, its success in absorbing the initial shock of Aleppo's capture is even more crucial today. And the resistance axis will not allow Syria to fall. It will recapture those areas that are seized by the terrorists in due course. And this resilience underscores the strategic depth also of the resistance axis, which continues to expand and to strengthen its fronts. And this is something that was highlighted by the leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, in which he recently spoke about the resistance actively preparing for a new phase of confrontation by positioning itself to thwart all of the US and Israeli efforts to reshape the region.
Well, your thoughts, said Mohsen. Do you think that the Syrian Arab armed forces and resistance fighters are able to repel this latest aggression by the terrorists? And do you think that to a certain degree that this could have been or should have been expected to take place?
As far as expecting it, one is disappointed that the very modern technological systems and surveillance systems that Syria should have at its disposal haven't allowed them to pick up on the troop movements and the preparation. One would have thought that that's an area that they need to really sharpen up on in the future. And it also calls into question the collaboration of, say, Russia, Iran, and Syria. I think in terms of who is leading, in terms of this defense mechanism, that will need serious reviews. But of course, what they've done in terms of response is very impressive. Within three days of taking this hit and the shock of it, they've now got the Tiger Force from the Syrian army in Aleppo. They've got major, forces of all the Syrian soldiers now there moving into Aleppo. They've certainly stopped this advance of the Takfiris in Hama, and so they're preventing them from actually reaching Hama itself. That was the other objective. So they'll have a job on their hands to obviously go door to door, house to house, cleaning up this the territory inside Aleppo, particularly which has been captured. But the thing is, having light infantry or light armored vehicles rushing rapidly to take over vast amounts of territory isn't a big deal. It's holding it that's the problem. Now, right. These kinds of ISIS-type forces have shown in Iraq before, many moons ago, that they are very capable of doing these kinds of rapid advances and taking over territory. Actually, taking on a real formal army with all the military hardware that they'll have and all of the kind of force they'll have is a different ball game altogether. These Takfiri forces, although they're being trained now in Ukraine, we have information to say this particular batch were very rigorously trained out in Ukraine itself during the war there. The fact is that they still will not have the kind of ability in an open warfare, in open field warfare, to be able to resist whatever the Syrians throw. And today, Iran has made some noises as well to say they would be prepared to deploy Iranian troops in Syria if they were given the green light. If Syria wanted them, Iran's forces will be there. And of course, the Kataib Hezbollah have also been saying in Iraq, the PMUs have been urging the Iraqi government also to allow them to send their troops. So all of this is bubbling into a more regional, effort to stop ISIS, because ISIS isn't just a threat for Syria. ISIS, technically, if Erdogan was really smart, he wouldn't be as stupid as to nurture such a dangerous force internally, something which would even bite Turkey in the back as well at some stage. But certainly ISIS still pose a problem in Iraq. ISIS Khorasan stretch as far as Afghanistan and into Pakistan. There's certainly a threat on the Iranian borders as well. So they're a force which the Americans are continually funding, continually training, continually using to create disruption, to create chaos. The minimum that they want is chaos from them, so that there's right. No easy ride. But the maximum is that they want them to actually take over territory.
Right. Well, Batu, what do you see? What will it take for the Syrian military and the resistance in general to defeat these terrorists once and for all?
Yes, so Syria, as we've mentioned, that's acting as a vital logistical hub for the resistance axis, is central to any attempt to dismantle the resistance axis that is opposing US and Israeli hegemony. So it will not be allowed to fall, that's for sure. That's a red line for the whole resistance axis. So expect, as Sayyid Mohsen Abbas said, the kind of intensification on the ground covered by the Iranian and the other supporting fronts for the Syrian Arab Army, and Russia covering through the airspace. Russia also providing that kind of diplomatic cover and support for Syria. And it's also important to note that the current democratic administration in power in America wants to kind of place mines in front of Trump, a kind of ditch in case Trump wants to kind of pull America out of the region, because as we know, Trump has those withdrawal tendencies. So a part of what we're seeing is also the American war. You've got the lobbying from those who support Trump versus the deep state. So those who are America first versus the deep state that sees the need to stay in the region. So I think the more intensification from the resistance, the more Trump, the kind of guy who doesn't like failures on the ground, will decide to de-escalate.
All right. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Gotta run. Thank you both for being with us. Batu Sabati, activist and political analyst out of London. Sayyid Mohsen Abbas, journalist and political analyst, also out of London. And thank you, viewers, for being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.